My name is Jasna Novak Milić, and I'm a lecturer in Croatian Studies and Director of Croatian Studies Centre. Today, I'll talk about a project that we've been working on for almost a year now, a project whose main goal is to cater for the Croatian community in Australia, in particular to help them maintain their language. Before I go in describing the project, let me give you a little bit of background, how it all started. So before I took over as a lecturer in Croatian Studies a couple of years ago, for 3 years, I worked as a part-time radio producer with SBS Croatian. I'm not a journalist, I'm a linguist, I'm a teacher, I'm an academic, but I've really enjoyed the experience in that role. And my favorite part of the job was to get out into the community and do stories that would very often include Vox Populi or interviews with Croatians everywhere in Australia. I remember many times I would come to the office the next day or after a telephone interview with someone, and I would discuss with my supervisor, executive producer of the Croatian program, Marijana Buljan, how difficult it is to get our guests in the program to speak Croatian. It always took a lot of persuading, encouragement, and also sometimes even promise that we wouldn't include their contribution and air it unless they were happy with the results. So what we noticed was that many Croatian speakers in Australia, while they can have an everyday conversation about everyday topics, they are unable to express themselves appropriately when discussing topics beyond their everyday language, especially topics that kind of would fall into their professional scope, and that causes a lot of insecurity and anxiety, and in some cases even shame. We know that language and identity are very closely related. So when speakers can't deliver in a way they think that they're expected to, they feel a certain dose of shame. So it's mainly that is mainly how the idea developed, like when we saw the need among our speakers in the program to develop their language past that home or kitchen language that they could speak, and to provide them with resources where they could do that through self-study. So what is our project? What is Easy Croatian? Easy Croatian is a weekly podcast aimed to help speakers of Croatian as a second language or heritage language and advanced learners of Croatian, primarily in Australia, to maintain and advance their language proficiency. News in the podcast are written in simpler and shorter sentences and are read at a slower pace. This is a collaboration between Croatian Studies Centre at Macquarie University and SBS Croatian. So far, we have more than 50 episodes. Episodes are between 6 and 8 minutes long. And when it comes to the difficulty level, most sit at B2 C1 level of listening comprehension proficiency according to the Common European Framework for Languages. What makes us go with news podcast? First of all, to be fair, B1, C1 level is not that easy, even though we call our podcast Easy Croatian. We could say maybe that's easier news in Croatian. Our aim was never to cater for beginners, because we feel that there are substantial amount of resources for beginners, but we are lacking resources for intermediate and advanced language learners. But first of all, we were aiming at second and third generation of Croatian speakers in Australia, which are showing signs of serious language decline. So another reason behind this is also heard from the listeners of SBS Croatian program that they find very often Croatian TV and radio program that they listen to too difficult to follow due to the complexity of syntax and vocabulary, but also because normally they're read simply too fast for them. We also had another reason for the news podcast is because of that collaboration between SBS and Macquarie. We had a platform that we could utilize. We had the production resources, and we also thought that podcast is actually, once produced and once published, it's easily accessible. All it requires is a device that can connect to the internet and that has speakers, basically. So on top of all what I've just said, another reason for behind the news podcast was also the fact that news will provide us with a variety of topics, which enables us to focus each week on different set of terminology. So we speak, or the topics range from political parties and climate change to industry and education, but I'll talk about it a bit later. So terminology is also in focus in every episode, and is explained at the beginning of the feature of the podcast. And that means that more difficult words or terms or expressions are translated into English in a contextual way. So it's not a dictionary, it's a glossary, which means that the translation would be given as per the context. What's in each episode? Each episode lasting between 6 and 8 minutes will start with an introduction in English. The reason behind the introduction in English is if a listener finds the podcast via podcast platform where there is no elaborate accompanying text, so that they know what exactly they're listening to. Introduction is followed by a glossary with Croatian terms and expressions and their contextual translation into English, and followed by a feature that is read at a slower pace. So this is what Easy Croatian sounds like.
This is Easy Croatian, a weekly podcast brought to you by SBS Croatian and the Croatian Studies Centre at Macquarie University. Easy Croatian is intended for those learning or wanting to brush up on their Croatian. News is written in simpler and shorter sentences.
So this is intro. I'll play a little bit of glossary.
Sjeniti.
To overshadow.
Oslobođen odgovornosti.
To be relieved of responsibility.
Nedolično ponašanje.
Misbehavior.
And followed by a story.
Žalio da mu gledatelji upućuju rasističke komentare, utakmica je prekinuta. Taj događaj zasjenio je uzbudljivu sezonu kriketa. Na teren je izašla policija.
You don't need to understand Croatian to realize that the news are read in a much slower pace than you would expect to hear on, for example, Croatian national television. But there is more to this. If accessed via SBS Croatian website, Easy Croatian news podcast provides learners with even more relevant educational resources that can further enhance their learning. Besides the introduction in English and glossary that are repeated now on the website as well in a written form, website contains the transcript with marked terms that appear in the glossary, and also it comes with a link to a vocabulary quiz, which is done in Quizlet. In other words, Easy Croatian is more than just a news podcast. It is a learning package for everyone, anyone who wants to improve their Croatian. So who is the targeted audience? I already mentioned earlier that we primarily had second and third generation of Australian Croatians in mind, but we were also hoping that potentially older Australian Croatians who are regular listeners to SBS Croatian would benefit from one story weekly that is read in a little bit slower pace. And of course, we were hoping that intermediate and advanced students of Croatian in Australia, including Macquarie Croatian students or elsewhere, would benefit from such a podcast, because to our knowledge, there is no similar resource anywhere in the world. So where can Easy Croatian be found? So the whole package, including glossary, transcript, and link to the quiz, can only be found on the SBS Croatian website. However, the audio itself, so the podcast itself, can be found in all major podcast platforms, such as Podcast Apple, Spotify, and so on. I mentioned earlier a little bit about the topics. So 50 episodes, we had a whole range of topics so far. So they are very diverse, and they include anything from COVID-19 stories, which you can imagine we had plenty of, real estate, finances, business, politics, climate change, tourism, everyday life, daycare, anything you can think of, we've probably already covered at least in one episode. Innovations as well, technology, and so on. So our aim is we usually choose so-called evergreen stories. So the stories that don't have expiry date, or at least not a very short one. Occasionally, we run stories that are contemporary, that are of importance, either for Croatians in Croatia or Croatians in Australia, or that are globally very important, but these are more exceptions than the rule. So after almost a year of producing the podcast weekly, regularly, the question is anyone listening? With less than 200,000 Croatians in Australia, according to the latest figures, and I'm assuming in the next, in this year's census, this number could be even smaller. Do we even have an audience? While the numbers that you are seeing on the screen might look quite small, for a language like Croatian, I don't think they're that small. And here we're talking only about 2-week time, a fortnight, where 3 of the episodes, at the beginning of November, 3 of the episodes were among the top 20 SBS Croatian podcasts. Usually, at least 2 episodes are in top 20 fortnightly podcasts for SBS Croatian. But like I said, at the beginning of November, we had 3 newest episodes, so episode 48, 49, and 50. If we compare just Easy Croatian episodes, so obviously the longer they are on the internet and available, more likely they are to get more downloads. So our most popular episode so far was the episode about whether employers can mandate vaccine for their employees. This one currently sits at 850 unique downloads. And I think that's a pretty decent number for, as I said, a language that has between 4 and 5 million speakers globally altogether. When it comes to how far we reach, we can't really isolate the data that we get from SBS, so that it applies only for Easy Croatian. So what we have here, what we're looking at, is actually the reach for all SBS Croatian podcasts. In other words, countries where they are accessed from, and we can see that people from everywhere where Croatians live or Croatian diaspora live are obviously accessing the SBS podcasts. So we can assume that if they're choosing SBS Croatian podcasts, that among those episodes, and based on the figures that I showed you before, that there would be also episodes of Easy Croatian. I know from the contacts with my colleagues in Croatia that some of them who are teaching Croatian as foreign or second language, or for example, using the podcast for their teaching in their courses. So is it all worth it? We think it is. SBS Croatian and Croatian Studies Centre at Macquarie, together through this project, are serving Croatian community in Australia and obviously beyond. helping members of the community in their language maintenance, which is really important for the community identity and personal identity of the members of the community. So here I've chosen some of the feedback that we've received from our happy listeners. We haven't received any bad reviews so far, the worst one being that it's sometimes hard to find the episodes on the internet. So what I like to see in the feedback is that the podcast seem to be achieving exactly the results that we hope to see. So it's helping Croatian speakers become more fluent or simply more confident. It's helping language learners comprehend and engage with the spoken language. It enables listeners to get that feeling of accomplishment and satisfaction when they can follow a piece of news and then potentially learn a few new terms or expressions or vocabulary that they can test later when they speak to someone from the community, and so on. The most important part, and I'll end with that, is that the whole package is available at no cost to listeners. All they need is a device connected to the internet and they can listen to Easy Croatian. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me or find me on Twitter. Thank you very much for your attention. Hvala.